Hello there. Welcome to another Criterion 60th anniversary memories interview. Today with me, I've got Ian Knight. Hello, sir.
Hello, sir.
How are you doing?
I'm not too bad. How are you?
I'm very well. It's
Good,
nice
good.
to
Looking
see
very
you.
well. Looking very distinguished.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, you mean grey, I think.
I was trying to be polite.
um, so, I mean, let's just get straight into it. When did you first get involved with the Criterion? Can you remember the first time you caught sight of it?
The first time was, I think, September 76, which was as I notionally joined. I'd been, well, I was at Caledon. I was doing A levels. Found out I wasn't very good at doing A levels. Wanted to join the BBC as a cameraman, and they wanted O levels and they wanted people with experience of tape recording and stage lighting. I'd done the tape recording, bit of a home hobbyist with that sort of thing, but nothing to do with stage lighting apart from having lit the school play. Of course, being a Caledon student, Jeff Bennett, Jeff Eames, Rex Sattrell were all there at the time. And there had been, because it was the year of the festival, there had been an article in the Telegraph about Jeff and his wartime experience, although there wasn't a lot mentioned. It was mainly about the Criterion. And he was a housemaster at the time, not my housemaster, but he was a housemaster. And as it looked, I was leaving Caledon. I went and literally knocked on his office door and said, "This is what I want to do. This is what I need. Can I join the Criterion?" They said, "Yeah, of course you can. Come along one evening, come along on a Wednesday evening. Usually the people will be there that you need to see or whatever. If you come along next week, there's a play on and there'll be somebody there each night who can talk to you. But you need to be talking to Carl Stafford and I'll tell him that you're coming so he can meet you." So the following Wednesday, trogged up to the Criterion. I think Mum and Dad dropped me off and I walked up to the Criterion. Dad remembered it because he'd installed some PA there back in the 40s or the 50s for a jumble sale when it was still the Methodist Chapel. So he said, "Oh yeah, I remember this place." And walked through the front door into, well, it seemed odd because behind this front door there seemed to be not quite an Aladdin's cave, but it wasn't what it looked like from the outside. Met front of house manager, can't remember his name, big tall guy, Peter something, can't remember his surname. I've been trying for the last week and can't remember his surname, and said, "I'm here to meet Carl Stafford." "Oh yes, he's in the bar, I'll introduce you," and took me into the bar, and there was Carl. And then we ended up getting into Carl's car, going to a production meeting at Louise and Pete Bagley's house for Savages. And the rest, they say, is history. So I think that was September 76. The Odd Couple was on. I was taken up to the control room to see The Odd Couple, and I think it was Steve Brooks. And I think, I'm not sure, it was probably Brian Ferryman on Lex for it. But as I say, it went from there. And then the first show proper that I lit was Savages in the October, November of that year. So 45 years.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually the year before I was born. So yeah, just to rub it in.
Yeah, I know. It makes me feel very old. And, you see Gareth Withers on Facebook and Twitter and you think, well, I remember him as a babby and being born. And you think, oh, right, okay, just getting old, and just let it wash over you, get on with it.
So were you operating that, or did you jump straight into designing?
I had a hand in designing Savages with Carl, because with the school show that I'd done, Jeff had done his usual thing and decided what he wanted to do, and it was left to us to rig it and execute it. I took part in the Belgrade Youth Theatre production that summer, but the Belgrade weren't letting anybody near their lighting equipment or their lighting board, so I ended up doing props for that. But Savages, yeah, Carl sat down and took me through the basics of design and how to colour and whatever, and what Jeff would expect to see in terms of colour. And went from there. The first proper show I designed was Hanswich and the Goblin, which was the Christmas show. December show that year.
And then you were pretty much what, 4 or 5 shows a year for, I mean, how many years? Pretty much all of them, really. I mean, there's been lots of people that have had kind of substantial periods away from the theatre, but you've
it went all the way through. Yeah, I lit 4 or 5 shows a year through till probably the late 80s. More through stupidity than anything, probably. I remember having a conversation with Barry Griffiths from Warwick Arts Centre once, and he said, "Why do you light everything?" I said, "Well, because, you know, there's me and there's a couple of other people." And he said, "Well, that's not a good enough excuse. You do realise that if you don't do it, somebody will. It doesn't all revolve around you. You've got to get yourself out of that mindset." But as I say, carried on till I think it was probably 87, 88 where I took a wee break, but that was only about 2 or 3 years before I came back and threw myself back in. But then because I was doing lighting stuff at the Albany as well, I could probably only do 2 shows a year, 3 shows a year. You'll know better from the archive list, but from 87, 88 through to 2000, I was probably only doing 2 or 3 a year, if that.
Yeah, no, that's about right. I mean, yeah, it should be said that the reason that you did everything was that everybody wanted you to like their shows because you were incredibly good at it.
Well,
we should leave that. You know, we should put that there. But then, you know,
yeah, you're right. It's just that my own professional insecurities won't let me acknowledge that, probably. Well, I remember having a conversation with Keith at one point because I'd turned up early for a first night. I was there at something like 6:15, and Keith was there because he'd got the lead, and he was there doing this key thing of getting himself into the mindset and just going over his lines so he knew where he was. And, "Oh, hello, Ian, are you all right?" I said, "Yeah, I'm all right." I said, I'm not sure why I'm here at this bloody time." I said, "Curtains on up till 7:30. And he looked and he said, "You're here this early because you care." "Oh, right, okay, thank you." And I always remember that. And a couple of times since, he said to me a couple of times, he said, "Remember, you're here because you care." I think, "Oh, right, okay."
Yeah, I think there are lots of people like that. Certainly some more than others. But yeah, I mean, I say, as far as I'm concerned, like, you are the lighting person that has been there pretty much the entire time that I've been there, lighting shows. I mean, you were also head of lighting for how many years? We've got no records of that. We can't check that on the archive, but
no, absolutely. Well, I think probably I took over, it would have been 77, 78, because Carl and Sylvia got married in the summer of 77. And they were in the process of setting up home. They were living in Camden. They'd got a lot of work to do in the house. And Carl consciously wanted to concentrate on that, as did Sylvia. And so the reins or the cup got handed to me to run with it. And that happened probably all the way through till 87, 88. I was production manager for a brief while. I replaced Paul Glenn as production manager around 1980, 81, I think, because I built Blood Brothers and a couple of other sets around that as production manager. And then it sort of lapsed. I did that until 87. And then that lapsed. We suddenly realized that there wasn't really a role for a production manager anymore. Things had started to run so smoothly. It used to be that the production manager was doing the Jeff bit of making sure that there were people to do a show and they were there and whatever, but departments suddenly had an influx of people who cared about doing it the same as I did. and they didn't need shivving along so much. So the role of production manager probably died out around 86, 87 anyway.
Is that when we moved to a sort of production committee model? So that it was rather the heads of department that were sort of all driving together.
It was that was part of an attempt to do that. Before that, we'd always worked on the play production committee thing, which was on the Monday night after the last night of the show, and it was basically just post-mortem of everybody and anyone involved with the show, and checking that we were going to get the next one staffed and sorted. And I think it was it might have been John Rusco that did away with that model, because he couldn't see the value in looking back all the time. He wanted to be looking forward. And to a certain extent, I agreed with him, as did Annie when she replaced him, that we should be looking forward all the time and not necessarily just one show or two, but two or three if we could. And so it became more of a play production committee or a production committee, not necessarily to validate the shows, but to be given a shopping list and told, well, these are the shows we're doing this next year. This is roughly when they'll happen. Get on and do it. And so an element of forward planning came into it, which, to be honest, seemed to do wonders for things, because rather than suddenly having the Mad Wednesday night of the play ringing people and putting 2p's in the coin box in the foyer and trying to find people who could work the next show or whatever, people were doing that 2 or 3 shows ahead, and people were volunteering to do shows because they would know when they were going to have holiday or when they wanted to work, because they were either appearing in a show or they were doing something somewhere else and they wanted to fit the criterion in. So I think that helped a lot in bolstering numbers and morale in the departments, because people could then plan ahead.
You just reminded me of that payphone. I'd completely forgotten about that. The one in the foyer used to be a payphone.
Yeah. The
long
old
time.
grey and black thing in the corner. Absolutely.
It was only in probably the mid-90s or something like that got actually changed into an open line.
I think it was, and I think it was done when the foyer got renovated and that wall got stripped down to reveal the bare brick.
Right.
I think it was Bob and Vic did it. Doug and Vic did it, and the foyer got renovated more and revealed that brick wall, and the cork notice boards were put up, and then the old payphone went knacker. It's strange how odd things like that you remember and think, like the old gas cooker in Coffee Bar when it was where box office was, and Joan thing always doing hot sausage rolls. Moments like that.
I cooked a meal on that for a play. I did props on, I think it was separate tables, and we served, we served the 3-course meal that was all cooked in the old Coffee Bar, as it was.
Absolutely.
Apple Charlotte. There was some sort of chicken dish in the middle and a starter of some sort that I can't remember.
Yeah, it's strange how memories get triggered by key points or reminiscences like that.
Yeah, and parts of the building as well. Like, occasionally we move something and find something behind it and go, oh yeah, that's.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. See an old paint color or an old bit of wall or a bit of plaster that's been bodged into a hole. Think, oh right, that's because we moved so and so or whatever.
One of my favorite things was going through the scene doc and seeing, the flats that have been painted on, and if you looked at the side, you'd find a chip of paint that was about 400 different colors all the way through it, because it had been
absolutely
painted on top of over and over again.
Yes. Yeah. Very much so. Can
you remember what your first impressions were when you came into the theatre? I suppose you knew people kind of from outside the theatre already.
No, I didn't really, because the only person I knew, well, the people I knew were Jeff, but only glancingly. As I say, he wasn't my housemaster, although he'd directed the play at Caledon. I knew Jeff Eames more than anybody because he was in charge of the school library, and I'd been a librarian for him. So Jeff I knew more than anything. And Rex Satchwell didn't ever act at the Criterion. He was always Talisman Priory. So I came into the Criterion and didn't really know anybody. The first person I met was Carl, Pete and Louise, Sylvia, and they were the people that probably I've stayed friends with the longest in those 40 odd years. I've not seen any of them for a while because of Rona and all that nonsense. But otherwise, they're the people I remember. And first impressions, no, I can't really remember first impression. I remember going through the front door. It was where it is. They'd obviously had been moved in the 3 or 4 years beforehand, and walking into this corridor and going through this wooden door into the bar, because it was when the folding door was in the foyer and the bar, separating the two. And of course, the bar was at the far end at that time. And there were just some bench seats. Bert and Elsie Turnbull were probably there, sat in the corner as they were on Wednesdays. But otherwise, no. And I wasn't really sure what to expect. Nobody in the family had anything to do with theatre or amateur theatre or whatever. And so it was all a bit of a wondrous experience. And
you said it was an Aladdin's cave. I like that.
Well, it felt like that because you walked through this nondescript door to this building which you couldn't really see because it was September and it was dark, and the front of the building wasn't lit in those days. We didn't even have, although there was the old sign up, it probably wasn't turned on, and all that said was Criterion, and you couldn't see anything else. Yeah. And remember being taken round the long way to go through wardrobe to go up to have a look in the control room. And say it just seemed to be this little Aladdin's cave or a warren of rooms that became this theatre. And I didn't see into the auditorium properly until we were rigging for Savages, which would have been, what, 5 weeks later.
That's about how long it takes usually when someone turns up to see if they want to join, to the point where they're suddenly thrown into doing something.
Well, it's always where the polish wears off, that the house lights come up and the workers come on, and you see the uneven paint on the walls in the auditorium and whatever, and it puts some people off, that the glamour that they thought they saw. But then it's the same in a lot of theatres. It is illusion. You go into any theatre, and no matter how grand they look, they always, well, invariably, from my experience having worked in the trade, repairing stuff in theatres, some of them do look like really, well, holes, for the want of a better word, with the workers on. They don't. With the
workers off, it was properly glamorous, like the auditorium.
Oh, absolutely.
The big purple curtains shut, and did they have the masks up at that point?
The masks were up. Ray Williams' masks were up. There was the old cloth helmet along the top, which was masking off the working lights. The house lights were, of course, the big par 60 or 80 lamps. There were just 4 of them. So the house lighting was relatively dark. And so it did look really something special with the house lights. Very rarely did we rig tab warmers, because there weren't the spare lanterns to have tab warmers. That only happened sort of 4 or 5 years later. So yeah, it did look properly glamorous. And that moment when the curtains opened and the first lighting stake came up, it always did look magical. 2 or 3 friends that I took always said they remember when the curtains opened, the big waft of cold air coming from the stage into the auditorium, because we never quite got the heating right. And the old Dravo on the side of the stage never really worked for anybody apart from Carl or Vic or myself, I think. But yeah, a magical place. Theatre is meant to be a magical place. And it certainly does that in spades.
Can you remember, are there specific productions over the years that stick out for you? Things that you remember seeing or lighting that you thought, oh,
There are two or three that sort of stand up. The one that really, I guess, sticks in memory most for various reasons is Journalists, because it was a world premiere. You like a world premiere, Ian? Oh gosh. And we sweated cobs on that, operating that every evening. It was a complex set of levels and swapped about a lot within that. It was fun to work. We came down feeling, we felt the 2 hours or whatever at the end of it. And so that always sticks in my mind.
and that was Arnold Wesker, and didn't he come?
He came the one evening, I think he came on the first night. Jeff wrote to him and persuaded him to come. And I think we even got a review in the Times or the Telegraph on the Monday.
Yeah, I think so. I'm still trying to find that, but I think people have
I think I
mentioned
might have a copy of it somewhere. I'll have a look and see. And if I can find a copy of it, I'll email you a copy of it. And I think I've got a program because he signed a load of programs for folk. I'll see if I've got that for you. If you've not heard from me next week, send me an email to remind me. But yeah, he came for that. And of
Must
course,
have been quite a lot of pressure to be operating the lights when he was there, and it was the first. If it was the first night of a world premiere,
we felt the pressure more that it was first night of a world premiere, not the fact that the author was there, because we didn't really know who he was. Jeff was the big fan and had fought to get the play after the RSC had said they weren't going to do it. And he'd enthused everybody with his own enthusiasm for it.
as he did many times.
As he did many times. And the cast had sweated cobs to rehearse it. And as I say, it was 2 hours of mayhem. Carl and I went in on the Sunday evening to run the show, just on cues, because we were afraid we would forget the changes because it was so complex and all done on that old lighting board. So that's the one that sticks in my mind for so many reasons. After that, the two Olivers that we did, probably, no, Christmas Carols rather. The first one we did with the levels on stage where Jim Connery was the ghost and whatever, and it was a big ensemble piece. One of Richard's first go at it, and then the second version that we did of it after we had the new lighting desk and dimmers, so we could do it the way that we'd wanted to initially, but we couldn't. And as I say, Christmas Carol holds a special place in my heart anyway, but I say those two productions probably, very boringly. And the only other one possibly Blood Brothers, because it's such a rollicking good story. And again, I think it was an amateur premiere.
Yeah.
And that was such a fab story. The music was so fab. It sounded so evocative because the band were in the wings for it. And say, yeah, they're probably the ones that are the standout moments. There were people who'd be sitting watching this and saying, "Oh, he's forgotten my play. He did fantastic lighting for my play, and he ain't mentioned it, the bugger." Yeah, I'm sure I did, and I'm sorry, but the ones that stand out are the ones, and of course, probably the one to crown them all, and it can't go without mention, is Nicholas Nickleby.
Yeah.
But on so many levels, that was a world apart from anything the theatre had ever attempted, and pulled it off so well, and truly an epic production. But yeah, they're probably the standout ones.
And anything happen off stage? I'm assuming that, with that involvement on a technical level, there must have been. We're always interested in hearing stories of missed cues and missed things going on. Anything anecdotal to drop in?
Not in terms of what happened during shows. The only anecdotes that stick in mind are probably out of shows and off stage. as I say, Carl always used to tell lots of anecdotal stories from when he'd started, and he'd literally come straight from Caledon. And over the years, some of them become my anecdotes, which isn't necessarily fair. But yeah, there were always miscues and odds and sods of hiccups, all taken with good grace by the directors, bar perhaps one who shall be nameless.
We'll get that afterwards.
We'll get that yes. But the only anecdote is from the summer of 82 or 83, when we'd had the lightning strike and we'd closed the theatre. We were supposed to do a show, I think it was in the May, June, and we'd cancelled that because we couldn't, there was a hole in the roof and the front of house lighting bar was hanging down off a couple of bits of wire rope. So Keith and Jim and Pete Turnbull decided that it was the time to start and redecorate the place, that we'd lived in a bit of a hole too long and it was starting to look rough. So they were going to redecorate front of house because that was the first bit the public saw. Clive Robinson and myself spent a happy few days getting high on glue fumes, sticking carpet down that we'd had from an exhibition contractor that Pete Turnbull knew. Lovely bright red, and painting everything else in the bar that you could see bright red. But it fitted the look that we were going for at the time and the company colours that had been chosen. One afternoon, we were almost at the finishing point. We were putting some lighting up in the bar so that it looked a bit more than just what it had been, which I think up until that point had been the old fluorescence in the trough around the outside edge. So it always looks a bit weird. So Clive was downstairs on step ladder putting up a light fitting. I went up into the control room corridor to run a cable for him. We've got the floorboards up, of course, and I've been diligently walking on the RSJs that were under the old control room floor, which had been put in to support that old heavy lighting board.
Sorry, what's RSJ? I mean, I know obviously, but for people who
it's
don't...
a big steel beam. They were 6-inch steel beams that had been put in, I assume, when the theatre was first converted, because the lighting board had moved up there. It wasn't there initially when they moved into the building, apparently, because I remember meeting somebody who'd known it being downstairs in the bar. So the beams had been put up, the lighting board had been moved upstairs. Walking along the beams as you do, because that's the only safe bit, ran the cable, shouted down to Clive, "Is that it? Are you done? Can I come down?" And he said, "Yeah, of course you can, no problem at all." Turned round and went to walk back through the hole to go out the wardrobe door, and looked down and suddenly realised I wasn't standing on the RSJs. I was standing on what I thought was the floor. And a brief moment thinking, get your foot off there, Ian, put your foot on the RSJ. And before that even really finished registering, the board had given way. I'd fallen through the gap between the two RSJs and landed on one of the old big black bench seats in the bar, 8 foot below. Watched as a cloud of dust rolled across the bar, like one of these dust storms you see on a Western, where you see the dust storm roll across the desert. It rolled across the bar. Clive was still up the ladder, screwing his fitting in place. And, well, it seemed like 5 minutes. In fact, it was probably only a minute or two elapsed. And I looked at him and said, "Well, are you going to ask if I'm all right?" And he looked and he said, "Well, I heard you swearing as you landed, so I assumed that you were, but are you all right?" So we both laughed about it and looked at the board, and it actually wasn't that badly damaged. We stuck it back up into place with a cheery, "Well, we'll have to come back tomorrow now and paint that join red," because the rest we'd already painted. And then both covered in dust because there was nowhere to wash in those days. It was before even the extension had been built. We made our way around to Keith Railton's house and knocked on the front door, and very shamefaced said, sorry, but we've made a hole in the bar ceiling, which of course then became a source of much hilarity for the next 3 or 4 weeks, because it was a bar night. I think it was going to be the first bar night the following week. For some reason, it wasn't that night. But of course, Keith turned up, and Rusco and Phil Bagley and crew were there. And for the evening, everybody was pointing out, oh, look at Ian's hole in the bar ceiling where he came through. And so that's the only anecdote really that ever sticks in my mind. There are lots of antics and things that we got up to that perhaps we shouldn't have done, but they're not for memories like this, perhaps. But as I say, in terms of anecdotes that you can tell your mum and not be ashamed about, yeah, that's the one that probably sticks in my mind, to be perfectly honest.
Did you leave a U-shaped hole in the ceiling, or was it just like a cutout?
No, it was bizarre, actually, because I thought I'd gone through and there would be a circular hole where I'd gone through. But actually, because the bar ceiling itself was literally just bits of fiberboard that had been tacked up to joists, which were the underside of the control room floor. It had just pulled off the nails. So the whole sheet came down. It was literally a sheet about 6 foot long by 4 foot wide, that then just sort of fluttered down and sat on the bar floor as I knelt on the bench looking at it and thinking, oh, okay, shouldn't have done that. So yeah, it's long gone, of course, because when Doug and Vic redid the bar and moved it sideways, they plasterboarded the ceiling. So my ignominy is hidden forever. There's
no plaque.
No, sadly not. I think Keith did suggest at one point he might, but no, he never got round to that.
So are you still involved with the theatre now? I mean, as much as anybody's been involved for the last couple of years, because as I always have to put in at this point, there's been a pandemic that's been going on for the last 2 years at the time of recording these. So it's all been a bit weird, but I think you last lit Goodnight, Mr. Tom in 2007.
I think that was probably the last one I lit. And that I've stayed in touch with people on and off, mainly with Carl and with Paul Harrison. I haven't lit anything since. I was supposed to light Bill Butler's show in 2018, but because it's a convoluted story, because Mum was on her own, having lost Dad in 2015. She wanted to go away for a few days, and it turned out that the time she had booked was the production weekend of Bill's show. Right. So never having been a person who believed that you can turn around to somebody the day before it's all supposed to happen and say, oh, sorry, can't do it, I did turn around to Bill 3 or 4 weeks beforehand and say, look, in fairness, I can't do this because it's going to push production week too far back or whatever. So I think you'd better find somebody else to do it. I don't think he was too chuffed. I think probably he understood why I did it. But there we go. And that would have been the last thing. But yeah, given the Rona, I've not been in the place since 2019. Probably I went down to see Carl a couple of times with the new dimmers they installed and whatever. He had some issues with those. And I went down to help him with those, but otherwise not been near the place since. But then I haven't been in the Albany either for 12 or 18 months, and I was the director of the trust there for 5 years. So it's been a strange old 18 months.
Are you looking forward to getting back to it, or?
I would like to do something. I would like to light a show or perhaps a couple of shows. I have to say, I probably feel a bit like Carl did in the mid-80s when he took a break of 3 or 4 years, that I don't necessarily miss it. There was a time when not being near the place for 4 or 5 weeks was being hell. but I've not missed it, to be honest. I've missed meeting. I've missed some of the people that I know, and the contact with the people that I know. I've missed being able to light something. So yes, I probably will. The book isn't closed, and I'm in no real rush to. So people needn't think, oh, I'll get on the phone, I'll email him because the first show I'm doing next year, I want him to light it. I'm open to people asking, but I'm in no rush. The theatre probably isn't in a rush to have me back necessarily. I'm sure there are other people there who are just as capable as me these days. But it's my spiritual home. It always will be. It gave me my career when I worked for Central Theatre Supplies, because without the experience from the Criterion, I wouldn't be able to pass that on through CTS. It certainly wouldn't have got me the job of chief electrician at the Albany. And I had 12 very, very happy and fun years there. And that's all because of the Criterion. So it is my spiritual home. It will always hold a special place in my heart on so many levels.
Well, very much looking forward to seeing you back there.
Thank you.
As soon as the world gets back to normal, and
yes, absolutely.
There are some bar nights coming up, I believe. They've just started to reopen on a social level. So fingers crossed that continues.
Yes.
And I hope to see you.
It would be nice that it can, and the community can start and get back to it, because to slam the brakes on again wouldn't necessarily be a good thing. With sociable animals, it's all very well doing Zoom and Teams and whatever, but you need to be in the same room as somebody, ideally. So yeah, I'm glad it is reopening, and that what they've done so far, I've seen the reviews on Facebook and the comments, they've been very well received. So I don't think it's necessarily harmed the theatre, apart from having taken a chunk out of its income.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, it's interesting, like in the span of the time you've been there, and particularly working on lighting, the technology, I mean, I was talking to Carl quite a bit about and Dave Cornish as well, about how the sound and lights worked in like the kind of 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and how much it's changed. I mean, that's sort of been your career, but can you imagine, like from the beginning to now, how much it's changed?
It's a world apart. I was thinking about it the other day. I came across an old picture of something I'd lit. I can't remember what it was. Oh, it was Lady Killers.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started back in 1976, the Criterion had a grand total of, I think it was 40 lanterns. There were 15 profiles, 16 Fresnels, a couple of 1 kilowatt Fresnels, and some floods. And if we needed any more, we had to ask Jeff, because he would bring them in from Caledon, and that was at most probably 7 or 8. But then suddenly, and it was the old bracket handle lighting board, where, you know, for a good show, it took 3 people to operate it. For a quiet show, you'd probably get away with 1 person. To in 1995, I think it was, we were donated the Sirius and the electronic dimmers to go with it in time for Christmas Carol. And suddenly, you could sit alongside the director to plot a show, which, you know, instead of having to call up and downstairs or down a bit or whatever, you could say to the director who was saying, well, that's not quite bright enough, or I don't think that's quite right, or put your finger on that fader and move it till you like it. And that was a big change. And the lantern stock had suddenly improved. We'd obtained bits and pieces. We were suddenly dealing with more stock. And then when we got to Lady Killers, and Carl and I often remarked the last 3 or 4 shows that I lit, that we'd gone from lighting with 500 watt lanterns, so the equivalent of an angle poise reading lamp, to using kilowatt lanterns, where you were using probably 5 or 6 at a go to light the stage. And the problems that we used to have of the dark spots, the eponymous voice coming from the back of the auditorium, there's a bit of a dark spot there, kid, can we sort it out? never happened because we were just lighting so much more evenly because we were using bigger lanterns, and that Carl had started to introduce moving heads and LED fixtures into the theatre. So instead of thinking, oh, don't like the colour on that, I'll have to find a bit of gel to do that, you can just dial in a colour and it's there.
Mm.
Or you've got a solo and you've got moving heads rigged for it, and you think, oh, well, no, they're moving, aren't they? Because they haven't found the right place to do their line, and so they're moving. I'm going to have to go up the ladder and move that light. You can just call up the fixture on the desk and move a trackball, and the light moves. Now, that was technology that Carl and I first saw at the Riverside Studios in 1980. No, probably 1979 at an ABTT show, when Strand first launched what they called their pirouette, which was a conventional spotlight, but they just added motors to it to move it and tilt it. And we looked then and thought, oh, wouldn't that be wonderful to have that? And, and we'd still wanted electronic dimming, but there was never enough money in the pot. And then suddenly, 30 years later, it's there. And we're lighting things in the same way that I was lighting things at the Albany, say, in 1991, 92, using intelligent fixtures and big lighting, big washes of light. So, yeah, the technology has moved on. It's made it a lot easier for a lighting designer. The time that Carl and I spent, that first sort of 5 or 6 years I was there with that front of house bar, because we'd only got 8 lights we could use on it. And we had to get they have to go in a specific way to get it to cover without getting any holes.
Mm.
And suddenly the problems changed because the lanterns were bigger, their field of light was wider. And so you just literally hung them and pointed them at the stage and it was lit. And you think, well, it used to take us an afternoon to get that right. Now it's taken us half an hour. And just to be able, with a lighting board, you've said it to me in the past. You've directed shows and you said, Ian, I know it's a pain, but can we change this cue? Can we just change this or move the levels a bit or whatever? And it's been, with the old lighting board, it was a pain in the bum.
Mm.
But now to be able to say, yeah, what do you want to change? Do you want to change the fade time? Hang on, let me dial it up. And you call the cue up, change the fade time, press record. And there you are, it's updated. And you can then mimic that through the next 2 or 3 cues. You don't have to go through 4 or 5 cue sheets to pick up where that first channel first came on, to change it in that cue, so it rippled through ready for the other cue. So technology for the desks has come on, and I think that's unleashed a lot of creativity.
Yeah,
certainly things like Lady Killers, Goodnight Mr. Tom. We couldn't have lit it the way that we did, or the way that I did, with the old lighting board. It would have been impossible. It would have been impossible to do the creativity. So yeah, the technology
creativity it comes through options, doesn't it? Like, as soon as you've got the options to actually do these things. I think we had a long chat with Pete Bagley about Lark Rise and taking the seats out of the auditorium, and so we used to have fixed seating in the auditorium, and as soon as that was gone, people were looking and going, oh, hang on, there's so much more I could actually do.
Suddenly realised how much more of a space there was. Yeah, yes, you're right. The options unleash the creativity, and they spur on more creativity and more options. I mean, the conversations that we had when we had that big steel beam put on at the back of the stage to prop the roof up, and what we were then talking about in terms of what we could do to open the stage out and whatever. Whereas back in 1982, the biggest concern was, let's get the hole in the roof patched up. And yeah, we know it's trying to do a pancake act, but let's just not worry about it.
I think the roof, at some point, the roof is going to have its own program. Like, we'll have to have an hour on the roof specifically, especially around that time and around the Treasure Island time.
Well, yeah, it certainly seems to be a recurring theme. Excuse me a second.
The lightning strike, I've got to say, is this is the first time the lightning strike's come up, I think, which a lot of people have forgotten. It used to be a little sort of birdhouse looking affair on the very top of the theatre.
It was a ventilator. If you look at Earlsdon Library, there's a similar lantern on Earlsdon Library, and I can only think it's because the architect for the theatre, when it was built for the Methodists, took a cue from what had happened at the library. It was the Earlsdon Library is a Carnegie library, I believe. And they were obviously at the cutting edge of design and whatever in the 20s. And I guess the architect took in mind what they were doing at the library. And so to try and tie the two together, he put a similar lantern at the Criterion. As it turns out, the lightning strike probably saved us some hassle because the timber was well rotten. When we eventually got it down and could look at it, the timbers were well rotted. It turns out that also the internal supports in the roof had been cut away unwittingly, which is where the roof got some of its problems from anyway. But the lantern actually, it was a favour that it went when it did, because I think we probably stood a real possibility. If we just ignored it and let it get on, that we'd have gone in 4 years later and found a bigger hole in the roof where the lantern had blown over and gone through the roof and whatever. But yeah, you're right. The Criterion roof probably deserves an episode by itself, one way or another.
Quite literally an act of nature. So that's probably the only other thing that's almost fallen through the roof apart from yourself.
Well, yes, probably. It would have been nicer if I hadn't fallen, but yeah. Roofs are the theme of the interview, probably. But yeah, the Criterion roof and trials and tribulations over the years. It's certainly been interesting. Yeah.
So, what do you think to the future? What would you like to see? What would you like to see it do? It become? Or would, like most people, would you like it just to stay as it has been?
I think everybody's natural reaction is probably to say for it to stay as it has been, but it can't. Life and things are fluid, and we can see that it's changed from when it was first opened back in 61 or 62, whenever it was. And it's not the organisation now, and it's certainly not the building now that Jeff Eames or whatever would recognise from the first days it was open. Things evolve, they have to. It's one signature, I think, has always been, it's felt like a community in its own right, as all good little theatres do, from the few others that I've come into contact with when I worked for CTS. The good little theatres become communities. They become a family. Some of the families just stand still and mark time because they're happy with what they're doing. They don't want to do any more. They want to put plays on. They want to have fun doing it. That's all they want to do. The Criterion has never seemed as though it's wanted to stand still. It's always felt that it's wanted to move forward as a being by itself. That sounds an odd thing to say, but with the innovation that we've done over the years and the way that Jeff pushed it and the likes of John Rusco and Keith pushed it in the productions it put on and the way it put productions on and the productions it did, it always wants to be something better than it is. I think if it can maintain itself as a community, which after the last 18 months is going to be very difficult, and if it can draw some of those members back to it, I think it can go forward and do great things. There's a big revival in little theatre and amateur in inverted commas. Generally, this was a topic that was a discussion at the Albany, and partly why we pushed for the capital works we're doing, and the council backed it for the capital works, is that arts and performing arts in particular have been researched to find they have a positive effect on the well-being of the people involved. Now, the Albany is doing its thing down at the bottom of Albany Road. The Criterion's doing its thing in Elston. There's no reason why the Criterion can't have the same positive outcomes on people's lives for drawing people in and letting them do theatre in an environment that is relatively benign. It's a safe environment. We know the building is relatively secure. It's not perfect. Some people will naturally be excluded by the nature of the building. Wheelchair users we've got an issue with, but we always have had. So putting wheelchair performers on stage will always be a challenge, but it shouldn't mean that we don't rise to the challenge. But I think as a community, yeah, we could grow, I think. Strange, I'm using the word we, and I haven't been near the place for 2 years, 3 years.
I think that's the Hotel California complex. I think you can check out.
Well, I think it is, but I think it's probably also the sense of family that it engenders. I mean, we've sat down this afternoon, and when did I last see you in the flesh? What, 4 years ago?
Yeah, probably.
And yet we sat down and chatted like old friends. And I know it would be the same if instead of you, it was Keith or Pete Bagley, or it was Carl and Sylvia. It engenders a sense of family as well as community. And I think that's his biggest thing. For all that there were people saying in the 90s, oh, well, the Criterion is very cliquey and it excludes people and it's a nasty place to be and whatever. That's not true. I think if you take the time and make the effort to be a part of its community, that community embraces you and it will support you and it will develop you and it will do good things for you. So that's probably what I hope for is in the future.
Right. So, I mean, that for me, the 60th anniversary has never been about the building, you know, as it's never been really about the nuts and bolts of it. It's been about
it's as an entity.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very much so. The Criterion isn't the building. The building isn't the Criterion. It just happens to be a shell. I mean, it could have been, we could have just as easily decided, because we put the importance of being earnest on at the Albany, or the College Theatre as it was, because that was the first show up after the strike was due and there's a stopgap. We did 3 nights there, I think it was. We could have just as easily decided then, well, hang it, we'll just use the Criterion as a social space and a scene workshop, and we'll do shows at the Albany or the Belgrade or the Arts Centre. But I think the community around the Criterion would have still survived. I don't think it's necessarily the community it is because it's in that building.
Yeah.
I think it's the people that make it that. And these people have said, well, if we moved out of the Criterion, we wouldn't be the Criterion. I'm not convinced that would be true necessarily. It's the people that make the Criterion. It's not the building.
Well, that seems like a very good place to leave this. On a warming note.
Good. It's been fun. Thank you.
It's been so good to talk to you. And thank you so much for sharing.
No problem at all.
And hope to see you soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And you too, matey.